So, Amy Bowe, just out of curiosity, the last thing Mr. Brandt mentioned, the fact that transparency within this field was rather poor. Is that something you agree with him on, an experience you share at Wood Mackenzie?
I think everything that Adam said is correct, and in fact, that's really the reason that about 3 years ago, Wood Mackenzie saw a real opportunity to leverage the data set that Wood Mackenzie analysts have cultivated to provide a sort of standardized and consistent view of emissions and emissions intensity across both oil and gas assets as well as at a corporate level. So we did find, in the wake of the Paris Agreement, we started to get a lot of questions from clients around what the implications would be for the oil and gas industry going forward. We expected, as has turned out to be the case, that in the wake of the Paris Agreement, there would be an increasing focus on emissions from the industry, starting with companies' direct and indirect emissions. And what we realized when we looked across the landscape was that there's really a lack of consistently available and standardized information regarding companies' emissions footprints. So to the extent that companies do disclose their emissions data, because right now all disclosures are voluntary, that tends to be at a relatively high level, either at the corporate unit or maybe at the business unit. But there's no granularity provided at an asset level. Moreover, these all tend to be historical snapshots looking backwards in time to explain the historical performance of the company. And it seemed more important for us to have a forward-looking perspective when we're talking about policies and regulations that are likely to come into play in the future. And so we wanted to provide a way to compare assets and companies on a like-for-like basis and to provide a forward-looking perspective for that. And so we worked with, again, the data set that we have, and we're lucky that we do have an upstream database with more than 31,000 upstream assets that we could leverage. And we did utilize the OpG model that Adam and his colleagues provided in Stanford to help inform the methodology that we have used to estimate emissions, although we have not used that model directly. But this challenge that Adam described was the primary reason that we embarked on this initiative.
Adam, can I just ask you one follow-up question? Would it be possible, or would you be able to develop a tool that can actually assess a single operation down to a single oil field, for instance? Would it be possible to have a tool that is that precise?
So the OpG model works at the field level. And so what we can do is basically put in operating parameters for that field, such as depth, water cuts, number of wells, operating reservoir pressure, productivity indices. The gas processing chain is very important, so what kind of gas processing equipment is in place. And so we actually use detailed information at the field level to make that estimate. In many cases, we rely on defaults, and that's an important part of the model, is when we don't have information, the OpG model is populated with essentially global data sets that let us fill in essentially and say, well, given industry practice elsewhere, what do we think would be applied in this case given the absence of information? And that allows us to work with incomplete data sets, which is vitally important and allows us to sort of incrementally improve. We analyze about 9,000 oil fields. We have about 800 data sources from the public domain, from Society of Petroleum Engineers literature and other literature sources we've collected over 10 years. And then we relied actually on the Wood Mackenzie data set, provided Aramco had access to that and did the interaction with the Wood Mackenzie data set. So thanks to Amy's company, for the incredible amount of work they've put in over decades generating that data set. And that allowed us to fill in for about 1/3 of global oil production. We didn't do independent data collection. We used essentially defaults and/or Wood Mackenzie data, and so that's a continuing, ongoing process. Imperfect, challenging, and a definite area for improvement going forward is how do we get better information. But yeah, OpG does make assessments essentially at the field level, not at the well level, but at the field sort of our operating unit level is the level at which we can do things.
Okay, thank you very much. Alessandro Blasi, just to change focus a little bit, you said it is difficult to keep up with the political ambitions, basically, when we look at the investment level and the energy mix in the future. Why is that?
Oh, this is a big question in the sense that, I mean, energy is a complicated sector. And also we tend, at least in this part of the world, to look energy from the lens of open market as we tend to look other sector. But there is a problem compared to other markets, is you cannot get rid of energy. You cannot have the situation where energy is not available. So it's particularly difficult to square the equation, having into it the environmental angle, which is, thanks God, is becoming more and more important. The economic angle, I mean, if you look around the world, in these days we had few countries where there's been serious turmoil for very little price increase of energy. Mm-hmm. The famous Gilets jaunes, I live in France, kick off from a proposal to finance the green energy transition with a few percentage of petrol price increase. So you have a different angles that you need to squeeze, and also the starting point is very different. As I said, you have countries that are blessed with natural resources. Some have more resources than others. Some have more sustainable resources than others. So it's very difficult to find a solution on this. Also, I think it's a matter of priority, in the sense that more and more you see one sector against the other. And also, I mean, if you look at renewables, wind onshore, look at wind offshore. Solar, look at bioenergy. I think it's a matter of priority. Climate is an emergency that affects everyone. So we believe as the IEA that we do not have the luxury to say, I don't want this technology, I don't want this other, I don't want that. What's left?
So I want to ask you about one thing, because I guess that will come up during the political discussion later on, because some studies indicate that limiting the supply would be an efficient way to reduce, since carbon emissions leakage won't be 100%. But do you believe in the carbon leakage argument? Because that's very much at the core of the Danish discussion when we discuss whether we should keep on the work in the North Sea.
Well, I mean, as I said, it's out of IEA role to say you have to follow this specific decision or not. We have seen in other countries decision to continue or to not continue in certain areas, including oil and gas. Now, I personally, there are two contrasting things. From one side, I do not believe that limiting supply change the picture. On the other side, we have also to keep in mind that our general attitude is if something is abundant and cheap, probably we are going to use in a not efficient way. So there are these two things to look at. But again, I go back to the presentation before. We need to get rid of the myths. Oil demand growth is not cars. It's not given by cars. It's petrochemical, it's trucks, it's aviation, and it's shipping. Probably, unfortunately, 80% of the things that are in this room comes from petrochemical. So we cannot decide, okay, we get rid of something and we don't know in which way we are using. So we really need to think exactly the different tech and the economic factor to be associated with it.
Amy Bo, just before taking a few questions from the audience, what would be your best advice to the industry? How should they position themselves in this transition?
That's a good question. I think the answer is going to be different for every company. Wood Mackenzie has looked at strategies that various companies are employing and are available as we transition into a low carbon future. And we can classify them in sort of 3 buckets. So there are companies like Equinor, like Shell, like Total that are very strongly moving into renewables and shifting their business models towards newer energies and clean energies. There are others who sit on the opposite end of the spectrum that are choosing instead to really focus on reducing the costs of their operations and, to the extent possible, trying to mitigate emissions from those operations in order to make them as sustainable as possible for as long as demand continues. And then there are companies that sit somewhere in the middle, and perhaps they're investing in some renewables as options and also trying to bring down the cost of their own assets, but they're sort of playing the middle ground, I suppose. And it remains to be seen, which of these strategies is really going to pay off. And again, not all strategies are applicable to all players. There are some companies that simply don't have either the capital resources or even sort of the skills and expertise in order to expand into new energies and renewables. And so for them, that may not be an achievable part of the balance. Obviously, on the other side, there's lots of questions about how returns from renewables compare against oil and gas returns, and will that be an investment that pays off longer term? So it's still too early to say, but it's fair to say there's probably space at the moment for a variety of strategies.
Okay. Well, let's see if there is a few questions from the audience. It's a little bit difficult for us to see you. There you were. Any questions for Adam Brandt in California, or Amy and Alessandro here? No? Not really? Well, anyway, I think it's been 3 brilliant presentations and keynotes, and I appreciate very much that the 2 of you would take all the way to Copenhagen to join us, and not least you, Adam, in California, getting up early in order to join us and tell us a little bit more about your studies. So thank you very much, the 3 of you.
Thank you.